Okay, welcome. This is the 4D webinar series, and today is getting started with 4D Mobile. Like normal, we're going to have a quick introduction here. We've got a shorter presentation than normal, 20 minutes, and then a 20-minute Q&A or so. Since many of you are new, I just wanted to show you that yes, you can submit questions throughout this webinar using the GoToMeeting interface. Just put your questions in here. We will take a look at those throughout the presentation, and at the end we'll get back to those questions and try to answer them all. And now, getting started with 4D Mobile.
Today we're going to look at how we can create a web app and a mobile app starting with an existing 4D application. In order to do this, we're going to use 4D v14 and 4D Mobile. So let's open up an existing application with 4D v14. The first step, if you haven't already done it, is to add the primary keys. This has been suggested for some time now, and it's indispensable for use with Wakanda. When 4D launches, you have an assistant that can help you create it. Today, we'll see how to use this tool, but naturally you can do this by hand, depending on you and your database. Here, the assistant will give us the option to either use existing IDs. For customer, it is chosen company. Here we'll rectify that we already have a customer ID that is more adapted. For invoice, no problem. The invoice ID appears. For lines, the assistant hasn't found anything. This is normal as it was an intermediary table end to end. No primary key was created because we won't need it to create the table. So we'll add one. Select Create a New File, and we'll keep the default option to create a UUID. For product, Product ID works perfectly. We're finished, so we'll click on Apply. It tells us that it will be created, and it looks correct, so we'll click on Apply. There, now we're done. We now have the primary keys for each of our tables, and we're now compatible with Wakanda. The second step is to have relations named correctly between our tables. All of the relations that we have between the databases should have an intuitive name, in order to easily connect the relations in Wakanda. Naturally, you can keep the default names, but because you're going to manipulate the data with Wakanda's object language, proper naming will be extremely helpful. Here we'll adapt them. For example, the link between invoices and customers is a many-to-one relation from invoice, which I'll name customer. For the returning relation, we'll simply call it invoices. We'll repeat the process for other tables. Each line in bills has a link to invoice, and each invoice has several lines. Same for the last relation. We'll now expose this via REST in order to access it in Wakanda. To do so, we'll go into Design mode and then into Database Settings. We go to the Web menu as 4D Mobile works via the web server, and there we see a REST tab. All we have to do is click on the Activate Wakanda REST Service option. Of course, we need to activate the web server to have access to our data, so we'll go over to the Run menu option, followed by Start Web Server. And now everything is ready to go for Wakanda. We'll be able to access our tables and create our interface. You can download Wakanda on 4D's product download page. Under the 4D Mobile section, you'll find the various distributions of Wakanda. So now we're going to launch Wakanda Enterprise Studio. Here we can create a new solution. Let's name it Invoices 4D. We'll use the default creation operations, which is to say we'll create a new project inside our solution, and we'll also keep a Git depot to manage our versioning. Okay, Wakanda is going to create the solution and the project. To import our databases, we'll use the Import Assistant in the File menu, then Connect to Remote Data Store. Here we can change the name we give our remote database, such as Invoices4D, for example. And we'll keep localhost as the IP for our server, because we'll use the local server during development. Then save. Wakanda has recognized the tables, which now appear in our project. If we open Invoices4D, we see the list of our 4D tables here. We'll open them and they're all there. By default, Wakanda only displays the relations of the selected table. We can, however, choose to see all of the relations. Here are some table properties, which in Wakanda speak we call data class attributes. You'll notice that Wakanda has created new attributes corresponding to the relations that we just renamed, invoices and customers. We thus have an invoice object in the customer table and a customer object in the invoice table, which will later allow us to address the relations. Save the modified files. We'll now launch Wakanda Server. We just click on the Start Solution button. And we'll click on the Data Browser. The Data Browser is a tool that lets us visualize the data. We can now see the 4 tables with their data: customers, invoices, lines, and products. All of their 4D data is now present, as well as their relations. We'll come back to Wakanda, where we can now create our own interface. To do so, we'll go to the main page, where we'll add some widgets. We'll start with a grid and adjust its size. Now we need to add a data source. A data source is a proxy for a table in the object model. Data classes correspond to tables in 4D parlance. They're available here under Model. So we'll take the customer class from the data store and drop it onto the grid. Notice that a data source has been created. Save the page. Now, if we run, we'll see a page open in the browser with the 4D data that has just been made available. We go back into Wakanda, where we'll now display our client invoices. This one is related to a client. So instead of just going to query the invoice table, we'll search for the navigation attribute that we just generated. So in Data Sources, under Customer, we find the Invoices attribute, which corresponds to our relation in the 4D structure, which will automatically retrieve the invoices related to this customer. Now let's customize this grid a little bit. On the lower right, let's see which fields to display. For example, we can hide the return relation to company. Back in the browser, we'll refresh. We see our 2 grids, totally functional, and we can view each client's invoices. Let's go back into Wakanda and further enrich the interface. We'll take a 3rd grid and we'll now display the details of our invoices. We should drag and drop a data source. In the Invoices data source, we'll look for the line attribute, which will drop onto our grid. Remember that the line attribute is actually a relation in 4D. We'll remove the ID of the invoices relations and of the line, which we don't need. We'll modify the product ID to directly use the product name. So we'll rename the label, and for its attribute we want the name of the product, thus product is the name of our table. And to access its name property, we add a dot. This is object notation, and autocomplete will propose the properties from the product table. All we have to do is select name. In Wakanda speak, we say that name is the attribute of the product data class. And there we have it. When we drop our attributes onto the grids, the linked data sources are automatically generated. We can also explicitly create them manually. If we click on the little plus symbol in the linked data sources section, we can select a data source line and then its product attribute. We have a new data source that's been created. We'll now add a preview of product details. This time, instead of adding a widget, then connecting a table or a data source, we'll directly drag and drop a data source. We'll take the product data source, drag and drop, and now we can directly configure our widget. Let's select a form. We'll customize the columns and delete the link to the invoice. Then we'll click Create. And now we have an area that displays the detail of the current view. We have nothing more to do than to rearrange the widgets. Back in the browser, we now have a completely functional web app. We can browse through clients, display their invoices, and get details on them. This app works very well as a classic web app, to browse from a desktop or laptop, or even a tablet. For smartphones, on the other hand, we can't really, for example, display all the information on a single page due to the screen size. A smartphone requires another type of navigation. So we'll create an application specific to smartphones with widgets and navigation that are adapted. When we put the application online, we should be able to switch automatically between mobile and desktop in this interface. To do this, we'll go to the upper right and in the drop-down menu select Smartphone. And here we'll see that specific new smartphone widgets have appeared. We use a widget that's rather familiar to smartphone users, the navigation view. It's a navigation panel. Drop it onto the smartphone and name this view Customers. Then we'll create the contents of this page. First, we'll drop a list view widget. For this widget to occupy all the space available, in the Style tab we connect anchors on each side and align it with the edges, placing a 0 in each field. We'll drop customers onto our list view. By default, the widget will display two types of data: company, hence the name of the company, and the address. We'll modify the behavior, and instead of displaying the address, we'll just have the city, for example. Perfect. We'll now configure the little button that will allow us to access the next view. We select, and then we go to the Event tab. Here we can choose the behavior of the button. As it happens, here we want to roll out the display of the next view on a click event, so we choose OnClick. Now we're going to do a bit of JavaScript. It's not very complicated, and it's a piece of code that we're going to reuse for all of the views. We'll start with a command with WAF, W-A-F, in uppercase. WAF is a key term meaning Wakanda Application Framework. So WAF dot, here I specify I want to access a widget, widgets in plural, then dot navigation view 1, which is the name of the widget, and we'll tell it we want to launch the opening of the next page, thus dot go to next view with a parentheses because it's a function. Note the uppercase and lowercase as JavaScript is case sensitive. Here's your line of JavaScript. It's not too complicated, and we'll see that we can do the same thing for the other pages. We'll now create the next page. Go back to the Index Smartphone tab and select the navigation view, and we'll be in the Properties. We create an invoice view by clicking on the little plus and adding the name Invoices. Now we'll add a list view We'll anchor it to fill the entire screen, margins at 0, and drag and drop the invoices from the customer's data source. We want to customize the fields displayed, so we'll keep the invoice ID, but we'll change the second field and put the total of the invoice here. So in the sources field, we'll specify invoices.vat total. And for the third field, we'll keep the default values. We'll now create the navigation link in the same way that we just did between the first and second view. Select the Events button, choose OnClick, and use the same code. Just copy and paste. We'll repeat the operation for a third view. Upon this detail view, we'll add a list view. And we'll add the invoice lines, so when we deploy the invoice, we get the line attribute that will drop into the view. For the first field, we'll directly look for the product name, thus line0.product.name. The second will have the price, so it'll be line0.product.price. For the last field, Wakanda has chosen quantity by default. We'll now create a new navigation link. Select the button, go to Events, OnClick, and we do our copy and paste. For the final view, we'll directly drop the product data source and use auto-generation mode. We'll remove the invoice line, or the return link, so to speak. Click on Create, and we replace the form in the center of the view. There, we've created 4 views. We've finished our mobile interface. To view it now, we can do it directly from the browser. So, run file, and we'll look at it in the browser. Obviously, in the browser, this style of navigation isn't quite perfect. However, if you're using Chrome, you can emulate a phone. There's certainly other emulation choices as well, but you have no trouble finding them on the web. For now, we'll open the Chrome debugger with a right-click, Inspect Element, and click on the little Show Drawer button in the upper part of the debugger, to the right, and finally, the Emulation button, where we'll choose to mock up an iPhone 5 and click on Emulate. There, we can now test our mobile app as if it were on a smartphone. The application is totally functional with 4 levels of navigation.
Fantastic. Before we get into the questions, I have one announcement, which is the 4D Summit 2014. Registration is now open. We're going to send a thank you mail at the end of this webinar that will have a link to the registration pages. But we have early bird pricing currently up. You get a $200 savings. Partners receive an additional $100 off. And there is an additional partner discount this year. Buy one ticket and get an additional one for a discount. Take a look into the registration pages for exactly what the prices are. Again, like we've mentioned in previous webinars, the summit will be from the 27th through the 30th of October. That's the pre-class on the 27th, the summit on the 28th and 29th, and post-class on the 30th. We will have announcements on what the pre-class and post-class will be later. We're still developing all of the content right now. Okay, we're going to get in the Q&A. We have both Dave Roberts and, Dave Robbins and Ad. Could you please say your last name, Ad? Thank you. Here to answer questions. Dave is the technical account manager for 4D here. He's been working with Wakanda for the last couple of years, and Ad is head of technical services. Let's see, did I have anything else here to get into? No. So we're going to take a look at these questions. We can pull up whatever screen we need to as we get going. Okay, what do we have?
All correct operations are supported. This is the basic operation. Every application that is built, not just through 4D Mobile, but Wakanda and 4D as well. So the answer is yes.
Okay, we have another question. Does the smartphone tablet views use a responsive design approach, or is it use a agent sniffing style? So Wakanda's strategy is to use the user agent to send out either a desktop, tablet, or mobile page. And for applications, I think that's a very good strategy. Now, can you use a responsive framework? Yes, you can. I've actually written an in-house application here in our 4D San Jose office, and I used Bootstrap from the Twitter guys, and it's a responsive framework, and that worked very well. There's no reason you can't incorporate other style sheets into your page and use a responsive framework if you want to. So the strategy that Wakanda defaults to is the user agent sniffing. But if you want to use a responsive design and just create one page, if that suits your application, you're certainly feel free to do that, and Wakanda supports that.
Now here's the questions about, can I use my own password access scheme? Can you show the login? Actually, I hope you're referring to
user authentication?
Right.
Yeah, for Wakanda, there is a default authentication from the Wakanda directory, but you can write your own user authentication. In fact, in most of my Wakanda apps, I create a user table and authenticate with my own custom method. And there's a Wakanda command on the server called set login listener, which will use your JavaScript method for user authentication, and you could authenticate any way you want to. Brian has a interject here.
Yeah, I just want to break in. So this is the first of 2 webinars on 4D Mobile. The next one, we do intend to go into how to use 4D's authentication system.
Oh, great. Well, look forward to that. But yes,
But
the answer is yes, you can.
Yeah.
Okay, we're looking for some more questions here. We have a question about, can you do restricting queries with 4D Mobile? And you can. In fact, you want to switch over to my machine and we can show that?
Do you want to demo that? Yeah.
Well, we're not going to demo it, but I'm going to show them where they would go. So the question was, can you do restricting queries on your merge outside catalog, your 4D catalog? And you can. So in this application here, you can see here's the merge outside catalog command, and I'm pointing to a 4D database that's running on my machine. But there is a property of the options object that you pass to the merge outside catalog command, and it's called JS file. And you pass it a JavaScript file, and in that file, you can actually write, add restricting query using the model API, and you can get more details in the Wakanda docs. But the basic thing to know is this property of the options object, that's where you can pass in your JavaScript file, and using the model API, you can write your restricting query.
The next question is, do you support phone rotation? The answer is yes. It's automatically detect the orientation of the device, and it will rotate automatically for you.
Okay, we have a question. Can I have the studio on my desktop and access the application on the server through file sharing? I have not tried that. The studio connects, the Wakanda server can be on a different machine. It connects through HTTP. So, the Wakanda server does not have to be on your machine. It does not use file sharing to connect. It uses HTTP to connect. Does Wakanda have any integrated libraries, i.e. a way to access the camera and GPS location of the smartphone, or can external libraries be integrated to provide this functionality? Well, that's a great question, and one of the great things about Wakanda, all the code that you write as a developer on the server side and client side is JavaScript, and there is a wealth of JavaScript libraries for the client and the server written, and you can take advantage of those. Especially easy on the client side, you can integrate any JavaScript library that you find on the client with Wakanda, and I've used a lot of them. On the server side, there's a lot of JavaScript modules that have been written, a lot for Node.js, and we've our developers have successfully modified those to work with Wakanda. So Wakanda is a very open platform, and because there's a wealth of JavaScript libraries written, and you can integrate all of those with Wakanda.
There's a question about the primary keys requirement from 4D side. If you are building your application through the flat table, there's no need to have primary key enabled. Now, as you can see, some of them are not enabled. However, if your two tables are linked together, that is, there's a relation, and those primary key will have to come into play in order for Wakanda to be able to load and deal with the data selection properly. So it is necessary for those situations.
The mobile UI is still iOS 6. Will Wakanda soon have an iOS default UI? And Brian, you could take that one.
Yeah, I was talking to Ricardo, product manager for Wakanda. There is a theme that's just been written that does update it to iOS 7. I haven't had the chance to take a look at that and bring it up for this presentation. It's hot off the presses, but yes, that has been worked on, and I believe it is ready.
How is licensing handled between 4D and Wakanda? Now, all requests that are coming from Wakanda to 4D are going to be through REST connection request. On the 4D side, every REST request that through Wakanda from a specific web browser is considered a client connection. So it will use 4D client license. Every connection that you have, that will be one client license. So although it uses 4D's web server, the license actually is not needed, except that you have to have enough 4D client license to support all of the connections.
How do you know if something like datatables.js is able to override the look of your grid view to have instant searching, but still have the ability to make changes directly to the database like grid view does by default? So basically, I think I'm interpreting this question correctly. Can you use a third-party grid tool with Wakanda instead of the native grid and get that to work? And the answer is yes. Wakanda has a couple of developer APIs, and it has a lower level API called the Data Provider API, which is not tied directly to a UI element. And you can use that lower level data provider API to integrate third-party widgets like a grid. And there's many examples on our forum of developers doing that, and it works very well.
Here's the question about the naming convention for the link relation in 4D. Now, here's the exact question. When creating the relations in 4D, you mentioned a naming convention for the link, so Wakanda can understand it. What is the naming convention? Actually, there's no naming convention. It's basically, you can choose to name your link any way you want. The easiest way would be name it with the one table and have something in the middle. Sometimes some people prefer to put number 2 in there or 2, and the last part of the name would be the many table. You can name it that way, or if the link is in the reverse, that is many to one, you can do it the same way. Start with the name of your many table, 2, and then the name of the one table. It really depends on how comfortable you are in reading those type of name, but there's no magic naming convention for it.
Yeah, you can name it whatever you want. I'll tell you the default for Wakanda, and you could follow this, when you have a table and usually you give it a name, a singular name, like company. And then when you create a related table, it will name the relation attribute company collection. It adds the word collection onto there. Some people prefer to use a singular name like company, and then a relation attribute in another table would be called companies. But really, it doesn't enforce, like Ad said, it doesn't enforce anything. It's up to you. Find a naming convention that you understand, and that will work. There's a question here about a PHP interpreter built in similar to 4D. I don't believe Wakanda has that. So the answer is no. As far as I know, I've never seen that. If it's there, I've used Wakanda 2 years and never ran into it. So
now also there's a few questions about licensing. The best place to find those questions, especially it depends on the configuration of your database and the type of deployment that you're looking for. I would recommend that you contact your account manager to have a better idea about the type of licensing that you need to purchase for your application.
Here's a question. In 4D, do you specify any port other than 80 for the HTTP server? Do you specify the port in the IP address when logging in from Wakanda?
Yes, the first question, yes. I mean, the default port number is 80. Now, if you are running both web server on a single machine, one has to be running on a different port. So if Wakanda is using port 80 for its own web server, then and talking to 4D on the same box, you have to probably choose another port other than 80. It could be 80, 80, or something like 81 from the 4D side.
And in the Wakanda merge outside catalog, to make Wakanda connect to 4D, there's a parameter called hostname, and you give it the path, the IP address of the Wakanda, of the 4D server, excuse me. And so I would generally think that since Wakanda is going to be the handling requests from the browser, that should be on 80, and your 4D web server would be on a different port.
Just a quick note to that, if you actually have 4D listening on, through a different IP address, you can actually using configure so that 4D is running through port 80 also on that specific IP address. Or the SSL. Web, on both sides, I mean, 4D and Wakanda, we support SSL. So yes, the answer is yes. You can configure your Wakanda or the 4D mobile application to be running through the secure connection. Now, it's whether or not you want the connection from 4D, from Wakanda to 4D to be SSL also, that's It's really entirely up to you. If you do, you can also configure the 4D web server to run under secure connection as well. So the REST request will be done through SSL.
We are going to write up the rest of those questions and all the ones we answered and send those out in a week. This is a regular webinar series. We're going to do another webinar in a month. The first Thursday of the month at 9:30 in the morning is our regular time slot. We are not entirely sure whether we're going to be running part 2 of 4D Mobile or there's another topic we're considering. We will announce that and let you know. The presentation from today was pre-recorded so that we could hopefully make it more clear when we stream this out, because I know it doesn't come across absolutely clearly. I've put both a full screen version of the presentation which does not have any of those zooms, as well as the exact presentation that does have the zooms, onto our webinar playlist on YouTube. So that link will be in the mail, the follow-up mail that I'll send out in just a little bit. You can go there and rewatch the presentation if you like and digest what you saw. So next 4D Mobile Part 2 webinar will include things about authentication with the 4D system, as well as a number of other JavaScript and coding related topics. This Part 1 was all about using the UI to build your web app, and we'll get into some deeper topics on 4D Mobile in the next 4D Mobile Part 2. I want to thank you all for coming. I hope this was helpful. Please give us your feedback at webinar@4d.com. Let us know what we can do better, what you liked, and we will see you again in 1 month for the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.